the title of the talk is Chipmunk or Pepe, and I'll talk a little bit about why Chipmunk and why Pepe as we go along. Let me give you a little bit of background, right? As Kevin mentioned, originally the paper was called Pindrop. This was back in 2010 in CCS. And at that point in time, it was largely a paper to determine the provenance of any particular call. So when someone makes a call, where is this call truly coming from? And to identify the provenance of a call, we were using acoustic signatures that different devices, different networks introduce into a call to determine, is this call really coming from within the US or outside the US? Is this call coming from an iPhone or is it coming from a Skype device? And so that became the origin of that PhD thesis. And then since then, it has fundamentally shifted to using that origin of that particular call to determine when a call is legitimate and when a call is fraudulent. And this talk is going to largely focus on that portion. That is, taking what was a PhD thesis and applying it to real-world problems. So let me jump right in, right? So if you actually think about three ways that you interact with a business, right? You can either go physically, right? And there's a lot of attacks on physical systems. You can go online, and there's a ton of attacks on online systems. Or you can pick up the phone and call. And the really interesting thing is that as more and more defenses have started occurring in the physical and the online side, you're starting to see a much more significant amount of attacks on the voice channel. We heard the earlier speaker talk about few attacks on the voice assistant side. These are attacks that happen at contact centers. So when you call your bank, your insurance company, your retailer, these are attacks that happen out there. And the really interesting thing about voice is it's the most popular channel. If you look at the data, right now you have about 40 billion calls that come to call centers in the US. In fact, there are 3.6 million Americans that are call center agents. That's 1 in every 89 Americans is a call center agent. That's 10 times the number of Uber, Lyft, and taxi drivers put together, right? Just think about that in mind. And, we talked about virtual assistants. There are 40 million virtual assistants. So, you have 3.9 human, speakers, and then you have 40 million. So another, step leap in the number of devices that are accepting voice input and trying to do some kind of service. And if you look at just the number of, the percentage of interactions, the percentage of interactions that any business receives, 78% happens on voice. So that's 5.6 times bigger than any other channel. And so it's a really, really interesting channel. It has tons of interactions. And the problem is it's extremely insecure. What these attackers are able to do is speak to a call center agent and fundamentally get access into your account. And if you actually look at a lot of the attacks, even the most recent, yesterday there was an attack that a cryptocurrency investor was suing AT&T largely because AT&T was the one who fundamentally gave up access to his account using a simple voice attack. So these attacks are becoming more and more prevalent. And the really interesting thing is all it takes is a little bit of smarts, right? So one of my favorite calls that comes into a call center goes as follows, right? The call center agent picks up the phone and this fraudster says, hey, I want to do a wire transfer for $20,000. And then the call center agent says, hey, can you tell me your mother's maiden name? Because right now, the only form of defense is what's known as knowledge-based authentication questions. How many of you have actually answered these questions? Mother's maiden name, social security number, date of birth. Yeah, right? And so these are questions, and this fraudster did something very interesting. When the call center agent says, what's your mother's maiden name? His answer is, my dad married thrice, so can I take 3 guesses? So that doesn't even make sense, right? So what if your dad married thrice? You still have one mother. But the call center agent actually allows him to take 3 guesses. His 3 guesses are the top 3 mothers' maiden names in the US. His last guess is Smith, which turns out to be right, and he wires $97,000 to a bank in England, right? So it's your hard-earned money that, as you're defending these other channels, the voice channel is so easy to actually get in. And you can actually see a lot of news articles that talk about it. So this is Home Depot. Even in the case of Target, what ended up happening is after any of these data breaches, what we see is a massive influx of calls coming into the call center. What happens after Equifax, Target is they have a collection of social security numbers or basic identity about a customer, and what they end up doing is take all of that identity, and there's two parts to a call center. One is the self-service, where you press digits, press 1 to speak in English, press 2 to speak in Spanish, and things like that, and then you have the actual agent speaking. This attack happened on the self-service portion, which is that where you press digits, and what these robotic systems started doing is pressing all of these social security numbers in massive quantities, because what would happen is if you call, let's say, a particular bank, pick any bank, you call that particular bank and enter the social security number. If that particular social security number banks with that bank, with that financial institution, it's going to say, welcome Vijay, your account balance is so much. If it doesn't, it says, oh, I don't recognize your social security number. Can you please enter it again? And so we've discovered calls that last 18 hours long, and all that's there on the other end of that call is a robotic system that's punching digits, trying to determine which social security numbers bank with which financial institution. So that was a huge spike in terms of what happened after Target as well as Home Depot. You also start seeing that even when you create very, very new forms of payment, this is about Apple Pay, we're seeing exactly the same thing against Zelle. Zelle is a form of peer-to-peer payments, right? You might have used Venmo, but Zelle is the banking-blessed version of it. In that case as well, even though Apple Pay and all of those systems are very, very strong, the registration or the tie-in between a card and the Apple iTunes account actually happens over the phone. And so rather than attack the actual tokenization mechanism of Apple Pay or the tokenization mechanism of Zelle, they just attacked the ability to associate the wrong iTunes with counterfeit cards, right? Or good iTunes accounts with counterfeit cards, and therefore completely beat the system. So that's on the case of Apple Pay. I don't know what happened just here. Sorry? Yeah. So I'm just going to put that back on. Hopefully that should have taken care of it. Okay, and then also, if you look at a lot of these scammers, this was a great article on NPR which talked about the first call that comes to you. Oftentimes you might have received a call, and when you start saying, hello, hello, there's no one on the other end. That's fundamentally the attackers trying to figure out, do you have a propensity for picking up phone calls? If you have a propensity for picking up phone calls, then I'm going to start asking you for details, right? I'm going to say, I'm Rachel calling from Card Services. You've lost your credit card. Please provide the last 4 of your credit card so that we can authenticate you, right? And so there's a lot of these attacks. So it's not only attacking the enterprise side, it's also attacking the consumer side of things by attacking the individual consumers. So this is crazy. Is there a reason? Am I touching something? So maybe I have to do this entire talk without slides.
Use your voice. Overweighting, we have the last 4 digits of your social security number.
For sure. It's 1, 2, 3, 4. It's as simple as that. Okay, and so you're starting to see a lot more of these attacks, right? And you're seeing attacks. The largest attack that we've stopped is about a $700,000 wire transfer here in the US and an £870,000 sterling in the UK. But these attacks get pretty significant. So if anybody wants to see, you can go to, there's a whole bunch of articles, you can go take a look at it. But what does that translate to, right? It translates to some serious money, right? So just the fact that you're losing money right now, what's happening is 61% of all fraud or all account takeover coming into an organization actually starts off with a phone call. So it's that high. And Gartner predicts that by 2020, that number is going to become about 75%. And so it's a really, really significant problem. It's about a $14 billion problem. And the way they solve this is by asking you those stupid questions. And those stupid questions cost another $8 billion. And then ID theft to Americans is about a $12 billion problem. So this is a pretty significant problem, and it is one of the reasons why, what was a PhD thesis started becoming a very important technology, for financial institutions, insurances, retailers, telcos, governments. We have right now 8 of the top 10 banks, 5 of the top 7 insurances, some of the biggest retailers, all as customers. So if you're interacting with some of the most popular organizations here in the US, they're probably using Pindrop behind the scenes. So with that said, I'm going to show you some of the data and some of the analysis that goes behind Pindrop. Currently, what we've done is we've analyzed about 731 million calls. So one of the things that I want to talk about is how do you do this at scale, right? So doing this for attack sets that are 10, and that's something that when I was an academic, it was fine doing research on very, very small data sets. Most of algorithms, most attack and defenses don't work at scale. And so it's really, really interesting to see what are the attacks that work at scale and what are the defense mechanisms that work at scale. So, we handle about 731 million calls that come from about 131 million phone numbers across 87 million accounts. So far, we've detected about 942,000 fraud events. But interestingly enough, the attack set is a smaller set. There's about 43,000 unique attackers. So that's the data set. So all of the data that you see beyond this is based on this data. Yeah? So really, really interestingly, first up, right, is how much of fraud happens at these call centers. So when we started back in 2013, the amount of fraud was about 1 in every 2,900 calls. So if you think about it, that means if I'm a call center agent, I'm getting 2899 calls that are good, and then this one fraud call that's bad. And so it was a really, really big problem. But even then, it's lesser occurring, right? And if you see, that number is shot over time. So in 2017, when we measured it across the customer base, we found that 1 in every 638 calls actually turns out to be fraudulent. So that's a massive increase. That's a 210% increase in voice fraud since 2013. So pretty significant. There's a whole lot more fraud. But how do you go about detecting this fraud, right? It's great to know that 1 in every 600 calls is fraudulent. How do you actually go ahead and detect this fraud? In order to detect this fraud, you need to understand what are attackers doing at scale, right? And so I'm a big fan of The Godfather. So we actually classified the attackers into the 3 rungs of the mafia, right? You have the Dons, the Capos, and the Soldatos. And basically the difference is over time, over these 4 years, how many accounts have they attacked? And a Don is someone who attacks over 50 accounts. A capo is someone who attacks between 5 and 50 accounts, and a soldato is the person who found your information somehow in a garbage bin and went about these attacks, right? So a lot of what Pindrop does is detect these attackers at scale. And so if you look at this, I'm actually going to run through what are these attackers doing, because then you'll start to get a sense of what are the techniques that are useful in detecting these attacks at scale. So the first thing that they do is use anti-spoofing. I don't know how many people have downloaded there's an app called Caller ID Faker on your Android devices. You can very easily download it, and you can spoof anyone's phone number. In fact, they have a very cool feature where you can sound like a woman as well. That's a voice distortion technology, and we see attackers use that. They use this other software called Screaming Bee, which also allows you further control on how you do voice distortion. But ultimately, that's tool uses anti-spoofing. But somewhere down the line, if you see the different categories of attacks are phone number deception. So how do I make the phone number look like a different phone number, or make sure that the phone number is so hard to pick? Using just phone number detection techniques will completely fail against those phone number attacks. The next is, what is standard, which is the knowledge-based authentication deception. So how do you answer questions for someone else? That's very obvious with Equifax. Most answers, everything that you know, the attacker also knows. And so those are, I won't spend too much time. I will spend time on the Annie deception and the voice deception attacks. So the voice deception is, there's a whole bunch of attackers who do a variety of things, and I'll walk through that. And then finally, on the recon and social engineering side, I won't spend too much time there as well, because that's largely done by robotic systems. I will walk through that at a later point. I mean, if anyone's interested, you can come talk to me. So jumping to the Annie deception, right? As far as phone number deception, the three most common mechanisms that attackers use is one, spoof your phone number. So they have, it's like a spear phishing attack. So I know a particular person that I want to go after. I know his phone number. I use these spoofing apps to be able to spoof that particular phone number. But not every attacker does that. Certain attackers have found much cleverer ways to go about it. Two mechanisms is using voice-over-IP systems and voice-over-IP gateways. In particular, voice-over-IP gateways. So for example, if you use your Skype laptop or your Google Voice system to make a call, the phone number that gets displayed at a call center is a very, very standard phone number. It's the same phone number for every single person who uses that particular VoIP gateway. And so, in that way, it's very, very easy to hide behind the genuine calls that are coming on that particular gateway. So that's one major threat vector. The other threat vector is just getting a simple burner phone. And the reason this attack works is because if you look at the amount, if you look at any organization right now, the amount of data they have on you, especially the phone number that they have on file for you, is oftentimes outdated. We've seen anywhere between 30%, that is only 30% of customers have the right phone number on file, and we do have customers who have 80%, but that's more rare. And so just using a simple phone number, any burner phone, most of these organizations are expecting any phone number to call on behalf of you, and so therefore that burner phone attack also works. So those are the three attacks. Pepe is one of these fraudsters. So you can see we've named all these fraudsters. The reason we've named all of these fraudsters is because our customers name all of these fraudsters. So Pepe is actually a fraudster who is French, and what happens is he takes these extremely long pauses, and he has this French accent, and so the customer called him Pepe Le Pause, based on Pepe Le Pew, right, the cartoon character. Chipmunk, on the other hand, is a person who uses voice distortion. He uses voice distortion both to beat voice recognition systems, as well as occasionally when he wants to go after a woman's account, he will actually distort his voice to sound more feminine, right? And so that's Chipmunk. And in fact, at Pindrop, every conference room is named after one of these fraudsters. Chicken Man is a guy who actually introduces the sound, additional sound, to throw off any of these voice recognition systems. So he uses chickens. There's constantly a rooster crowing whenever he makes a call, which is extremely interesting. We've had other people as well. We've had people, for example, there's this woman fraudster who very often uses a baby crying. And she uses the baby crying to great effect, because when there's a baby and you're saying, hey, I have this baby crying, my husband's not at home, I really need you to give me my social security number, call center agents break, right? And so it's very, very interesting the way they use, we in the previous talk, we saw a lot of, very advanced technological ways of beating systems. These are very, very simple-minded mechanisms, but they work with crazy effect, right? And so, and then synthesis, which is an attack which we've not seen in the wild except for one case, and we don't know whether that is a synthesis system or not, is a attack that will happen. And I'll actually show you a demo of a voice synthesis system at the end of the talk. But you have all of these different attackers fundamentally using one of these techniques to get around basic defenses of these customers. I'm actually going to play you Chipmunk, so you can hear a call. Hopefully you guys can hear it at the back. It's call audio, and in this particular case, unfortunately, this is a stereo audio, and the signal is a mono signal, so you might not hear it, but let's play. So watch for the fraudster. He says his name is John Johnson, but he's using a voice distortion technology, so he sounds extremely squeaky. Can you hear it?
Hello, my name is John Johnson. My account number is 543-654-765.
All right, Mr. John. Can I please have your date of birth and the name of your employer?
December 10, 1951. I'm retired now.
Okay. What was your date of birth again?
December 10th, 1951.
So, so I won't play the entire call, but this is, an example. This is Chipmunk actually calling in, and he's using a distortion technology to fundamentally throw off any voice recognition system that has previously identified him, right? So how do you detect somebody like that who's using some of these mechanisms? Because, a lot of these folks, right, in fact, a lot of these attackers have now started doing clever things ahead, right? They call in and they say, hey, I have had this voice box implanted in my throat, so please don't make fun of me, and then they speak, right? And so these call center agents find it very, very hard because their job is your service, right? And so it's an extremely interesting thing. So the rest of the talk, what I'm going to do is talk a little bit about how you actually detect this, right? So, and the talk is split, is focused largely on how do you detect fraud at the agent. So when a call really arrives at the agent. I'm not going to spend time about how you detect fraud when it's a machine dealing with another machine. It's very, very interesting how you detect fraud there. We have several mechanisms of how we do it, but that's a big open piece of research that we're still working on, so I won't spend too much time there. But when you have to detect fraud at the agent, as I've mentioned, you have to be able to detect anti-spoofing. You have to be able to detect, when it's coming over voice-over-IP gateways. You have to detect when it's coming over international locations. You have to detect when things like voice modification are in play. And a lot of this allows you to identify when, these things are being done, through anomalous characteristics, right? Anomalous characteristics that you can determine in the audio. We saw the dolphin attack earlier. If you actually look at the audio, if you do an FFT or if you do a MFCC or any of the standard audio techniques, you will find a very, very clear separation in the audio domain of those attacks. But that's what you need to do, right? You need to be able to understand what does human speech sound like and when there are deviations on that human speech. The next part of it is we find, as I mentioned before, the dons attack a lot of accounts. So it's very, very advantageous for you to be able to detect fraud when it is happening in a repeated fashion. And so we'll talk about three of the things that we do. One, if the person is using the same phone number, you can use something as basic as a phone number velocity check, right? But the more interesting things are a lot of fraudsters change their phone numbers very often. So how do you, again, jump into the audio domain to detect when the same device is being used or the same voice is being used, right? And so that's fundamentally it. I will not go into each of these details, right? If anyone's interested, come see me. I will talk about some of the audio mechanisms that we use to detect some of these attacks. So what are the techniques we've used, right? Again, there's a lot of audio signal processing that happens at Pindrop. I'm not going to go into all of the detail because it's going to take, probably, we have about 1,380 features, audio features. If I spend time, the Pindrop paper, the original Pindrop paper talked about 3 features, but 3 features in a total base of 32 features. That has expanded, once to 147, and the latest iteration of these audio features is about 1,380 features. So I won't go into detail, but here are the kinds of things that we look at, right? We look at frequency, and a lot of these devices, as was mentioned, use filters, right? Use all kinds of filters. So what are the frequency cutoffs that occur as a result of these devices? What are the frequency cutoffs that happen in the network? The next thing is noise, right? It's an extremely interesting part of our work that spends time looking at the non-voiced audio. So you have the voiced audio where people are speaking, but in fact, a lot of our features are in the non-voiced audio where there is the noise spectrum. And really, really interestingly, a lot of devices introduce what's known as comfort noise. So comfort noise has a very interesting background, right? So traditionally, when you moved from analog to digital, you fundamentally, in the analog world, there was always some kind of background noise, right? And so that's what characterized early phone calls. But once you move to digital, when someone wasn't speaking, there was nothing being produced. So you would hear deathly silence. And because you would hear deathly silence, when the first voice over IP systems and the first cell phones were introduced, a common complaint used to be, are you still there? Because if the person wasn't speaking, you'd hear deathly silence. And so a lot of these systems actually generate algorithmic noise. And how do you detect that algorithmic generated noise is an extremely interesting part of what we do, right? And so that's another big piece of this entire thing. Comfort noise actually has a much more interesting reason to exist. It's in the way your brain understands words, but I won't go into that in this particular talk. And then what are the loss characteristics, right? I've taken one example. Every single device, because every single device and every single network is actually creating a model of your voice. It cannot capture the full breadth or the full analog complexity of your voice, so they're making approximations. When they make approximations, there are certain loss characteristics that are introduced into the call, and so you can detect that. A very intuitive example is, for example, when you use a Skype system, that Skype system will have packet loss. That packet loss will manifest itself as tiny breaks in the call audio, which is something you can't hear because a packet in Skype terminology, it will be about 10 to 30 milliseconds, right? They sometimes, depending upon where they are and the bandwidth present of that particular network connection, they will combine one or more packets together or one or more voice segments together, but typically you can see packet losses at the rate of 10 milliseconds. So when you look at a call analysis, you can actually look at the audio and determine that there are constantly occurring packet losses, and statistically if they follow a certain pattern, you can then make the certain determinations. So, and if anyone is interested, please go. I mean, there's a ton of papers that we've published from the Pindrop time, right, which talks about a lot of these individual features. You can go check them out. Just search for Pindrop on Google Scholar and you'll find them. And then on the voiced audio piece, right? So the non-voiced audio piece, we largely look at segments outside voice to determine several of these things. On the voice side, we're looking at, what is the pitch? What is the shape of the vocal tract that could have produced this voice? Because very, very interestingly, when you actually look at the vocal tract that was responsible for producing this, in the case of synthetic voice, you actually see all kinds of physical anomalies. So one crazy example is we saw this fraudster, and when we translated this fraudster's voice to what was the vocal tract that could have produced it, his neck had to be 7 feet long because he was going through crazy transitions. So for example, when you say, hello, Paul, you're saying hello with your mouth wide open and Paul with your mouth closed. That transition can happen only at a certain rate. This guy was going through those transitions because he was using a voice synthesis system, and our research team dubbed him Giraffe Man because he has a vocal cord that's 7 feet long, right? And so being able to look at the vocal tract is another way that you can actually determine what's happening. And then finally, the most interesting one is the dictionary, right? Which is when a lot of these devices, what they're trying to do is create, they can't provide all of your speech. So what they're doing is they're parameterizing your speech, and that parameters are passed in the form of a dictionary. So when I see this is the kind of speech that I need to produce on the other end. And so by virtue of doing that, they're able to achieve crazy amounts of compression. But those dictionaries leave telltale signs as well. So, you can look at those dictionaries as well. But fundamentally, these are largely the techniques we use. So let me jump into a few cool examples, right? And I won't go into the features because it'll take me a while to walk you through what the exact feature means. But this is, for example, when you use the different voice over IP systems as compared to any other system, right? So this is Google Voice over Cell, Google Voice. You can see that the Google Voice systems have certain frequency characteristics that are very, very different than any other phone. And in fact, if anyone is interested, I can show you all the kinds of graphs between Google Voice with iPhone, with Android, HTC. There's all kinds of graphs. Skype has a bimodal distribution here, so that's interesting. interesting, but this is just one feature, right? Between the 1380 features, even though it has a bimodal distribution here and creates confusion, you will see other features that allow you to separate. But ultimately, what this helps us do is looking at frequency characteristics in these non-voice sections allows us to understand what are the characteristics that some of these devices like Skype, Google Voice introduce, and then that allows us to identify when a call is a voice over IP device, even when it is, claiming to be a cell phone. Because one of the major techniques of doing anti-spoofing is using voice over IP systems to do anti-spoofing. So even though anti-spoofing apps exist, they're largely using voice over IP infrastructure to do that. So you actually kill two birds with one stone by being able to determine voice over IP systems pretty significantly. And just to show you the advantage of that, you will actually see that voice over IP systems by far are the biggest contributor to fraud. So 44% of all attackers use voice over IP systems or voice over IP gateways. This is the distribution of voice over IP systems across the different verticals. And so you can actually see it averages out to be about 44%, but voice over IP systems are the biggest side. Every time the blue bar is cell, and largely those blue bars are burner phones, right? So burner phones is another big section. So that's one example of using frequency characteristics in the non-voiced audio to determine things like voice over IP systems. The second thing is, in the voice side of the audio, you can also do all kinds of things. As I mentioned, a large part of what we do is modeling the vocal tract. And in this particular case, you can actually see all the blue bars. If you look, all the blue bars, blue section is natural speech. All the red section is speech where it is distorted. It's either using pitch shifting or some other technique to change the frequency of the voice. And when you look at that, even if you just looked at fundamental frequency or formant frequency, which is a technique used a lot in speaker recognition, it would just sound like a woman, right? Like it would actually fail. You would actually detect this as a woman speaking, and so no different than any other woman speaking. But what happens is if you model the vocal tract, you can actually determine a very, very clear separation. And so if you actually look, that the circles are that for males and the crosses are for women, and you can see there's a very, very clear separation. And so that's an example of using vocal tract features to be able to determine when things like voice modification are occurring. And then finally, the entire 1380 features actually allows us to create a very, very nice print for a particular device. And it's using this print that we've identified clusters of these fraudsters. So one example is we've identified this gang of fraudsters that come out of West Africa, which we call West Africa 1. It's a fraudulent call center, and this fraudulent call center, all they do is wake up every morning and dial for dollars. It has 12 different people, and we have a single phone print or single device print because it's all coming from that one call center that detects them. And we didn't know the effectiveness of our solution until one of our customers flagged this out, because we were detecting the same group through the same phone print over and over again. And as an example of the success of that solution, they actually played us several call audios where you could hear on one call audio a call center agent speaking to one fraudster, and the fraudster was being asked the social security number, and he said it's 1234. And because the line from Nigeria is really, really bad, there's a lot of packet loss, and so he keeps asking him, what's your social security number? And he gets frustrated and he says, it's 1234, damn it. And then on a completely separate call, attacking a completely separate account with a completely separate voice, and it's a separate voice, it's not distorted, it's not pitch shifted, it's a completely separate voice. You can hear this person attacking another account, and in the background you can hear it's 1234, it's 1234, damn it. All of that identified by a single phone print. So this is actually the 1380 features. This is the eigenvalue, the eigenvectors, the top 3 eigenvectors, and you can start seeing this is a separation of the phone print against all other characteristics. But the cool thing that happens is once you start characterizing the audio, both the voiced and the non-voiced audio, this is all non-voiced audio, to be very clear, right? Not the voiced audio. If you start characterizing the non-voiced audio, the amount of audio characteristics that are introduced by devices and networks are so unique that you can actually create a very clear separation between any device and any other device. And so it's pretty cool. It's almost like an audio fingerprint, and it's why it's called a phone print. So I am going to quickly wrap up. How much time do I have? About 10 minutes. Okay, so I want to open up for questions. So, I just wanted to quickly spend a little bit of time talking about the engineering that goes into building a system that is of scale, right? A few things to note, right? So, I don't know. Yeah, so a few things to note, right? Why is this hard, right? One of the biggest reasons it's hard is everything is streaming. So, for example, one of the standard things that you do in signal processing is try to find out what is voiced speech and what is non-voiced speech. And that's a very simple thing, right? You're trying to look at the energy of different segments, finding out the median energy, and then anything that is in some percentile of that median energy is voiced, and everything else outside that median energy is non-voiced. Now, if you do medians, if anybody knows how to calculate a median, right, calculating a median for streaming audio is extremely hard. You have to do something very, very clever to be able to determine, a median for streaming audio, right? You have to do it with heaps. But interestingly enough, that becomes the backbone of a lot of the engineering architecture, right? How do you determine everything at streaming where things are constantly changing? Just to give you an example, the risk analysis that evolves throughout a call changes. So oftentimes you will have, let's say, a legitimate customer's voice being the first part, and then it gets taken over by a fraudster because there's a man-in-the-middle attack. So, the fact is that you can fundamentally have an attack come at any point in time. More importantly, you can have some anomaly be available to you at different points in the call, right? Maybe initially the fraudster is just using his voice and then distorts his voice. At the moment he distorts his voice, you can do this. And we have fraudsters who do that. We have fraudsters who act like both the husband and wife combination in an account. And so watching that transition happen is a very, very important indicator to determine something is off on that call, right? And so the fact is that these predictors vary over time, and new information can arrive at any time. So just to give you an example, what happens in a particular call is initially the portion of the call where you're making the call and the call hasn't yet arrived at the customer. That's called the pre-ring section. So the stuff that you can do in the pre-ring section, and we have somebody from Verizon here, we actually work with them to do a lot of that pre-ring portion, right? So that's one portion. And then after that, it comes into the IVR, where you can start looking at, is this bad guy ever seen before? So you can use the effect of the consortium. So one of the things that I talked about is there are 43,000 attackers. The really cool thing is all the customers that we have contribute to a global consortium, where if we find a bad guy anywhere at any customer, we're able to use that information across our entire customer base. So that allows us, to determine when we've seen this attacker before. And then, you have all of these. SAFE and SWAR are two different systems. SAFE is our streaming audio feature extraction. It's what does a lot of the phone printing, and SWAR is the voice portion of it, so the non-voiced and the voiced portion. So SWAR is the secure voice analysis and recognition. So those two systems, now that audio is available, you typically don't have audio when you're pressing digits, and then you have audio when you're speaking to an agent. So you have new predictors that can provide machine learning outputs when that is opened. And then you also have humans providing reinforcement. So the way Pindrop works is we determine a particular call is fraudulent, and then there is fraud investigators who go identify that this fraudster is really a fraudster or not. And then they come back and say, yup, this is a real fraud event or it's not. And oftentimes when they provide that, happens many, many days later. In fact, we have this one example where this fraudster was attacking us constantly. We were catching him because of his voice. And then what happened is he got caught, he got apprehended, he was put behind bars. And then months later, we suddenly started catching his voice again. And then what we found out is that he had smuggled cell phones into his actual physical cell and started making calls, dialing for dollars again, right? And so, the fact is that all of these inputs can happen at very significant points in time. Just to understand how you do that, for people who don't know, there's a concept called a Blackboard architecture where you can use streaming pieces of information, and the Blackboard is, it's essentially, a group of people coming together to solve a problem, right? So you have the phone number, you have a whole bunch of pieces of information, but they're all coming together to solve a problem. And so how do you build a system that simulates this Blackboard kind of concept? And so that's what the architecture is all about. So you have a moderator who essentially takes care of the Blackboard, and then you have different systems that are predicting, providing extraction of new features, as well as APIs that get information from the customer about what's happening. And all of that orchestrate in what's known as a rock tumbler to then provide this risk score. I won't spend too much more time, right? I'll open up for questions. I think there's a lot of interesting future work, right? How do you detect fraud in the IVR when there are DTMF tones? How do you detect outbound fraud when there is things like call forwarding and things like that? How do you detect voice synthesis? And with that, let me just finish with a demo, and then with a voice synthesis system. Yeah. So this is a voice synthesis system. So just to show you how easy these attacks are, this is Pindrop's voice synthesis system. As you can see, we have a bunch of people, right? So we have Ariana Huffington, we have James Earl Jones. We can pretty much synthesize anybody's voice. So I'm going to take President Trump, right? And I'm going to say...
Your USENIX security paper is accepted.
Okay. I was trying to say something even more crazier than that, but let's start off with that. So, so what this is doing is it's essentially going and pulling out Trump's audio, right? And it's not trying to just replay pieces of words, because that would take too long. What it's actually doing is it's creating a machine that will simulate all the characteristics of his vocal tract and then fundamentally synthesize that. In this particular case, it's just because this is a live demo, it's doing it with just a single minute of audio. So it's going to do all of this and generate audio in with a single minute of audio. And so the quality, based on the amount of audio that you have, changes. I don't know why this is not synthesizing. Okay, so there. Okay, so, so that's the audio. So let me hopefully play that.
Your USENIX security paper has been accepted. It is a great paper. It is going to be huge.
So that's on demand, right? And so, fundamentally, those are the kinds of attacks that we protect against. Thank you. I'll open up for questions.
All right. Thanks, Vijay. We have time for just one or two questions. Come up to the mic, state your name and affiliation. Thanks. It's going to be a race.
Hello, this is an awesome talk. Tavish Vaidya from Georgetown. So my question is, have you tried looking at the Google I/O demo and taken that audio and tried to detect whether it was a human or a machine?
Yes.
And okay, and you can detect
I will actually show you that.
Okay. And
so,
my second question
so
is,
if you actually look at this, just give me 1 second.
Sure.
So we actually have Google duplex. Female and male, and we can detect that. And the reason we can detect that, just for your own edification, is there's something called fricatives, which is, when you say, when you're essentially voicing something through a narrow channel, and fricatives, aren't necessarily, you don't need to model fricatives really, really well in order to listen to them. They're harsh sounding, so they're very distinct from anything else, and so it's easy. So the Google duplex system can't mimic human evolution, right? And so therefore, its noise characteristics around fricatives is totally off, right? And so that's one of the reasons we're able to detect that. But go ahead.
And are you worried about the threat, like when you combine stuff like Lyrebird with the technology that Google is displaying?
Yeah.
What that would mean for the future of like voice security? Because essentially, if you combine those two technologies, you have a perfect voice clone.
Yep.
That can mimic any conversation and any real-time conversation.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
So perfect is the operative word, right? Because one, it depends upon how much of audio you have, right? In fact, in order to be, if you look at the Google duplex system, the Google TTS system required about 23 hours of this voice actor saying the same, different sets of consonants, right, or different sets of phonemes. And so that you require that kind of audio to be able to determine the exact voice with all its richness. And even then, you have these issues of fricatives. So yes, it is a scary future, but the point is, the good news is, one, you require tons of audio, and the second part of it is you have human evolution, right? Your voice box, the diaphragm, all your vocal cords, the back of your throat has been shaped over millions of years. And so that ability allows you to detect things in speech that machines are really not able to capture. But is there a future, 20 years where it's completely a human clone of you? That could be.
All right, just one question, right? So one question per person.
Quick question. What happened between 2015 and 2016? I mean, the numbers of frauds just jumped.
Yeah.
What happened?
Yeah, so if you look at we spend a lot of time in the dark web as well. So if you look at the dark web, what ended up happening is a lot of attackers started writing blog posts detailing how they beat systems. So they started sharing their knowledge that, hey, the voice channel is such a simple channel, just go after it. So they started saying, hey, use this technology called TuiTalk, and we've seen detailed posts. And what ended up happening is just mass adoption, right? More and more attackers said, why do I spend time against all of these crazy defense mechanisms? Let me just attack the voice channel.
Okay, it's a philosophical question. It's essentially it's an arm racing situation, right? What if an attacker attend USENIX and listen to your talk, and will that tomorrow Pindrop will not be able to detect some of the attacks?
Yeah, so it's an interesting thing, right? I've told you about these features at very, very high levels. Making these features work at scale is extremely hard. Making them robust is one of our biggest things. We spend a lot of time making sure a feature is robust. In fact, a feature goes into the wild. It's the Google model, right? You send a feature into the wild, you let it test against 1% of the 700 million traffic, and you keep making sure that feature is hard to beat. And so these features are extremely hard to beat. The West African fraudsters, they originally were directly making calls. Then what they realized is they're getting detected. They hacked a PBX called Magrathea in UK and started routing all calls from there. And so the feature vectors started changing pretty drastically. But here's the interesting thing. When you have a call from a customer coming from, let's say, New York to, let's say, a call center in Atlanta, that has a certain physical path. If you now see a new call claiming to come from this customer coming from Nigeria with a stopover in Magrathea and all of these characteristics that get introduced by that, you start seeing sound characteristics that never should exist in such a path. And so the more they do things, you actually see more sound characteristics being introduced because of the physical limitations of some of these attackers. But if an attacker decides to attack every single person here by going and physically locating themselves with that person and then going to the next person, yeah, that'll beat our system, but that's kind of not at scale.
All right. We're about to get kicked out, so one quick question.
Quick question. Is this service real-time or it is real-time? Do we need specific hardware to accelerate this service?
It is all real-time. So all of this happens within so it depends on which piece. We have several engines that happen within milliseconds, so even before the call arrives. And then we have the audio portion, which typically takes anywhere between 5 to 7 seconds of audio. So the person speaks 5 to 7 seconds, and 300 milliseconds later, you have a score. So it all happens in real time. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks, Vijay. Let's thank Vijay as well.